This is Grassroots Television, America's first and oldest community television station.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here with all of you in this gorgeous spot this morning. And the subject matter of this is great presidents. And I know that you, Mr. Schlesinger, and you, Senator Simpson, are asked all the time, because Steve and I are asked all the time, and we're nowhere near as knowledgeable. So if we're asked, you're really asked. Who was the greatest president you ever knew? Not in history, but the greatest president you knew.
JFK.
JFK. But why? What made him a great president?
His term was abbreviated, tragically abbreviated. But the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Okay. You're fine.
You're fine. Go ahead.
The Cuban Missile Crisis was not only the most dangerous moment in the Cold War, but it was the most dangerous moment in all human history. Never before had two contending powers possessed between them the technical capacity to blow up the world. And this was the most dangerous moment in human history. And he was determined to get the missiles out of Cuba, but he was equally determined to get them out peacefully. And he handled that.
Senator Simpson, the much missed in Washington, Senator Simpson. Yeah, well, by everybody who counts. You and I share something, which is, of course, we are congressional brats, having had our fathers, and in my case, my mother, serve there before we ever showed up. So that the spate of history that you look at is really not only your own, but your father's as well. And in looking at that, who do you pick out?
I was reflecting with this woman that I've been living with for 51 years that I had met in my lifetime 10 presidents. Hoover was the first one in Sheridan, Wyoming when I was a boy. And then on down, the only ones that I never met, I met John Kennedy, I met Johnson, well it goes Ike and so on. I didn't ever meet Harry Truman or FDR. Knew several of the cabinet, Harold Ickes, and we used to talk, his son, and it was in the Clinton administration. But the thing that, the greatness of the ones that I worked with, Carter, and Reagan and Bush the first and Clinton, the greatest trait of was their sense of humor, except Carter had a lot of trouble with humor. He didn't like stories, especially those that were often came across my desk. And then, of course, he served no booze in the White House, and Goldwater said any guy that won't serve booze is just curious, that's all. But I'll tell you, he was superbly trying and incompletely achieving. And he was a good man, and I think he was a very good president. He would get obsessed. I mean, Start 2 was he was obsessed with, if I remember, Start 1 or Start 2. And he worked us over. I was brand new in '79, and he called me to the White House, and I sat there for an hour with the President of the United States, and I thought, man, this is living, you know. But Reagan was a man. Well, he has been eulogized and idolized since his death, but he was a terrific guy to work with. But the most decent president, I haven't said greatest yet, but the most decent man I ever met in politics was George I. Almost too decent in some respects. A very self-effacing. He was told by his mother never to toot his own horn, and if you don't toot your own horn will not be tooteth. And then Clinton, of course, he loved stories, and he and I had a lot of fun. The greatest president for me would be George I, even though his achievements wouldn't have matched Reagan, nor his persona wouldn't have matched Ronald Reagan. But my part here will be to describe some marvelous anecdotal material.
I should say that I never met FDR.
Steve, you've covered White Houses, you've taught about White Houses, and taught about the question of what are the elements that make a great president, in your view?
Well, actually, the first president I ever met was in the company of my wife here.
Well, the first one I met was Eisenhower. I say I've met everyone
But
since.
I have to tell you the story of the first time I met a president. Cokie's parents, of course, were very good friends of Lady Bird and Lyndon Johnson. And they were starting to entertain after the tragedy of the assassination. And one afternoon, Lady Bird called Lindy and said, you know, we're having this big reception. It was summertime. We're having this big reception for some visiting African potentate. And we're having a big lawn event after the dinner. So if Cokie has a beau, we have some extra tickets. And so this was late in the afternoon. I was just down from Harvard. I didn't own a tuxedo. And so I am desperately trying to put a tuxedo together with studs from somebody and a shirt from somebody else. And Cokie is putting her outfit together, and we're standing on the receiving line as Lyndon Johnson is advancing toward us in the company of this berobed African potentate. And the studs on my shirt started popping out. Because the outfit didn't fit, right? I mean, I had pieces from everybody else. And the heel of her shoe broke. So there we are. I'm meeting a president of the United States for the first time, clutching my shirt closed while my date is hopping on one heel. It was not an auspicious beginning for someone who was going to make the presidency one of his areas of expertise. I think there are three qualities that I've noticed in the presidents I've covered and studied. Courage, clarity, and honesty. And often I think presidents have two of the three, but not the third. And I think that's true of our current president. On the plus side, I think one of the great strengths of his presidency and one of the reasons he was reelected was he does have the gift of clarity, a gift that Ronald Reagan had as a communicator. He says a few things simply and clearly and maybe interminably to some of you, but he does have the ability to communicate people in a very clear and direct way. And I think the single biggest reason he was reelected was because he convinced a lot of people who now perhaps regretting their vote that he was going to make them safer. And now that they realize there were consequences to elections and the guy who won, who's going to make them safer, is also going to pick the next Supreme Court justice, I think there are probably some people who are regretting their vote, but he succeeded in that clarity. And I think there's also a certain sense of courage with George Bush. He is willing to take on tough issues. I give him, for instance, credit for taking on Social Security, not because he necessarily has provided a very good solution, but he had the courage to take the issue up when the Democrats have been supine in pretending that this is not a problem that the current country has to deal with. But George Bush's great flaw is his failure of the third quality, which is honesty. He has clarity and he has courage, but he doesn't have honesty. he led the country into war without telling the country the truth about the situation. And I think that it's like a flaw at the I had a friend whose father was a sculptor. And he used to spend a lot of time with his father in Italy picking out the perfect piece of marble for his father's statues. And he said this was the critical stage of any piece of sculpture, because if there was a flaw at the heart of the piece of marble, the sculpture itself would be fatally flawed. And I think that lack of honesty in this president has been that flaw at the heart of the sculpture. The clarity is there, the courage is there, but the honesty is not there. And I think this has been true in in Iraq. I think it's been true in the Social Security debate. I think it's certainly been true in his economic proposals. So you look for a president who got all three: courage, clarity, and honesty.
Do you gentlemen agree that those qualities are the ones that matter? Mr. Schlesinger, should a president be honest, or is that getting his way?
There was another president of the other faith who had the same flaw. So we're supposed to be talking about greatness. I say there was another president of the other faith who had the same flaw.
Oh, sure.
And you know, it's we all have a flaw. I mean, I got a lot of them. But the greatness to me was that if they recognized their flaw and then moved on. And Nixon used to come to the Senate, and Dole would call the minority party to come and visit with Nixon. And he would get up and absolutely stun people with his knowledge of the world. And Mitchell was there, and Nunn. I mean, we did a lot of that in those days. They don't do any of that now because they figure it's just, you know, I don't know, but it's very sad. But nevertheless, Reagan's greatness was this sense of humor. And then when Nancy would go off to Scottsdale to see her doctor father, he would call Bumpers and myself and Heflin and Gene Taylor from Missouri, who loves stories, and he'd say, Nancy's not here. Come over to the White House tonight. We're not going to talk about anything that has anything to do with legislating. We're just going to tell stories. And I'm going to pour the drinks. And he stood there with this green blazer with the ducks flying across his pants, you know. You've seen that. And he poured out some stiff stuff, and we just sat around and laughed and told stories till about 10 o'clock. One day, and I must relate, we were very irritated at Ronald Reagan. And all the Republicans went to the White House, beautiful spring day, crocuses on the table. And Jack Danforth, our leader, then at that issue, got up and said, Mr. President, you have told us a few stories. It's very funny. It's a beautiful morning, the crocuses, it's springtime, but we came here because we are irritated about something. Reagan listened for about 2 minutes, and he stood up, and he said, any of you people ever heard about a telephone? He said, why the hell didn't you call me? Don't come in here and give me that crap.
Well, it's all right, because it's the answer that counts. Is honesty a useful trait in a president, or does it get in the way?
It all depends on the situation. I mean, again, the Cuban Missile Crisis was concealed from the American people. The solution, which was a deal, a trade of the withdrawal of American missiles from Turkey, but they concealed that. The structure of the crisis did not permit honesty, full honesty. But Harry Truman, for example, the first president that I ever met, was remarkably honest and blunt and clear in his mind and his judgment. I think honesty should be a requirement of the presidents, but presidents never should say never.
You know, Jamie Whitten, this is a name most of you probably don't know. He's the longest serving member of the House of Representatives in history, and he was the chairman of the Appropriations Committee, which made him, as Senator Simpson can tell you all too forcefully, that he was by far the most powerful man in the Congress, and no one's ever heard of him because he never went on television. Now, part of the reason he never went on television was because he talked like Demosthenes with the marbles in his mouth. And he did it on purpose. I discovered that he actually could speak English, but he found that it was very much to his advantage to just, you know, talk like this, and often he was doing it while he was at the gavel going, so nobody could understand a word he was saying while he was getting everything he wanted into an appropriation bill. And so as he was ending his tenure, or no, I guess as the anniversary approached where he would become the longest serving member, I went to do a long interview with him, which was challenging. And I actually thought some of my success as this congressional correspondent was that I could do simultaneous translations of Jamie Whitten. But he said to me, and this gets to this point, he said to me, I said, how do you account for your success? And he said, well, you know, Cokie, I've always believed you have to be honest, but there's no need to be candid.
I think that Alan has made a very good point about great presidents in terms of the willingness to deal with people in the other party. Because I think a big part of President Kennedy met regularly with the Republican leadership. President Bush President Reagan met regularly with the Democratic leadership. And I think that the polarization in Washington, it's a cliche, and you've all heard it many times, but it's true. The fact is, Cokie and I have been in and out of Washington for 40 years, and this is by far the most partisan and divided city. And I think that it cries out for someone who actually genuinely listens to the other side. And I think that presidents of both parties who have been great, one of the things they have done is understood that they are a national leader and not just a partisan leader, and that they lead the whole country and not just their party. And that the permanent campaign where all you do is mobilize your base and not believe that the other side has anything reasonable to say is a great flaw in the current White House, but other presidents of both parties. I wish that, when I covered the Reagan White House, on a regular basis, there would be Democrats coming down to the Oval Office. They'd meet with the president. They'd come out and talk to us, the reporters on outside. You never see that anymore. That's Thanksgiving turkey has a bigger voice in the White House today than Harry Reid. And I think this is one, but the flaw is not all on one side in this, because the Democratic Congress. Now you can say who started it. It's like the Palestinians and the Israelis. But the fact is, the Democrats also have not reached out a hand to this president in any significant way. I mentioned Social Security. It is profoundly, in my view, irresponsible for the Democrats to simply sit back and say, we're going to let the president do it. We're not even going to have our own proposal. So I don't think the fault is all on one side here, but I do think that one of the elements of greatness that Alan mentioned, and increasingly the fact that Alan Simpson is here and not sitting in the U.S. Senate, is a reflection of one of the problems, because people like Alan Simpson, who made their lives on Capitol Hill as pragmatists and problem solvers and consensus builders, find the atmosphere so polluted today that they don't want to be there. Jack Danforth, who you just mentioned, is another very good example. Look at the Republicans who have left the Congress in the last few years, the Senate. It's Warren Rudman, Jack Danforth, Alan Simpson, Bob Dole, Nancy Kassebaum, Bill Cohen.
Same thing with the Democrats, though.
Mac Mathias. I mean, the list goes on, and Sam Nunn on the Democratic side.
Sam Nunn, John Breaux, Bill Bradley, it's the same thing.
The center has hollowed out of the U.S. Senate. The center has hollowed out of it. So this president has a problem in that there are relatively few people on the other side who, if he picked up the phone and called them, would come to the White House. But he has to lead. That's what presidents do.
Did you, Mr. Schlesinger, see that with the Kennedy White House? Did you see that he listened to Republicans?
I see what?
That President Kennedy listened to Republicans?
Yes, F. Dirksen, the Illinois, who was the Republican leader in the Senate, they had a joking relationship, as Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan had.
Yeah, that was something so striking at the Reagan funeral last year. Almost every story people told were about Ronnie and Tip and Ronnie. It was just, it was, the two names were linked. And they were bitter enemies on policy, but it didn't matter. It didn't slop over.
Kennedy defeated Cabot Lodge for the Senate in 1952, but that didn't interrupt their friendship. And Kennedy appointed Cabot Lodge, who ran as a vice president in 1960. He appointed him ambassador to Vietnam.
Well, that might have been a punishment. I actually interviewed President Ford not too long ago about the Constitution, but we were talking about things in Washington today, and he was saying he was minority leader of the House when my father was majority leader. And he said, we used to go downtown in a cab together to the press club, and we'd say, all right, what are we going to talk about? And we'd get there and we'd have a debate. And he said it was a genuine debate. We did disagree on how to get from here to there in terms of policy, but then we'd get back in the cab and be friends and go back up to the hill together. And the saying used to be that you could disagree without being disagreeable. Now I think people who agree are disagreeable. And what is the president's role in all of that, Alan? How does a president try to help that?
Well, Reagan was very good at that. He just would call them, as you say, as Steve said, they'd come out of the White House, you covered it. Bush was very good at that. You remember when we did the trade agreement with China, it was the congressman from New York, Steve Solars, who carried the water for Bush in the House. I mean, really carried water. He was terrific in that. And then we all went to the White House after the successful vote and had a great time. There was a great number of bipartisan support there. I always listened to Arthur. I have letters from him, this gentleman, because he was, when I'm in the Carter administration, and I'm in the minority, and Ted Kennedy was a very close friend and is today, and Arthur, of course, that legendary friendship, and he would, sometimes I would see him and he'd say, I think I have a point here for you on immigration. You remember that? Yeah. Other things. So he was a source of support and inspiration to me too. And I just always had the door open. It didn't matter to me whether they had a D or an R behind their name. Nixon, of course, had great suspicions, and that was proven. But George Bush really loved he loved his pal and all those pals he served with in the House, Sonny Montgomery, and those guys became a great source of support. Right, yeah, right. And then George was a pixie, but nobody knew it. One night we were in the White House about Christmas time, snow all over the place. He said, let's go up on the roof and throw snowballs. I said, I'm game for that. And he said, tell the Secret Service, though. He said, I better do that. But one night we're in there all alone. Ann and Barbara had gone off somewhere. I'm in the Lincoln bedroom. I didn't pay a penny for it.
I was about to say,
I actually got up and opened the door where this portrait of Lincoln, it is the most piercing, dour, or doer if you're Scott, it just drives you crazy. I had to push something in front of it. But I went down and George was getting his evening massage. He goes to bed at 9 o'clock. I don't go to bed at 9 o'clock. I said, is anybody in the White House tonight? Anybody? He said, no. I said, then tell the Secret Service I'm going to start in the laundry room and go all through the building, in every room, see every painting, and mess around. I did for 4 hours. Had my own tour.
Did you meet any ghosts?
Well, I tell you, it was a magnificent time because it was just me wandering through every room of the place. And those are kind of things you never forget. Now, Clinton, I have to tell you. Now, listen to this bit of history. What a slice of history. Ann and I are taking George and Barbara down the east front of the Capitol to the helicopter to leave Washington. The Clintons step out of the limo, and Ann and I walk them up, just the four of us. So we kiss George and Barbara goodbye, and here come, and I'd met Bill when he was governor, and we're going up the steps, and nobody around. I mean, it's an interesting gap. It's not a gap in the presidency, but it's a gap that you never forget as you're the assistant leader walking the president down, and the new one who in 2 minutes will be president of the United States. And Clinton said, "You know, Simpson, Bumpers has told me all about you." I said, "What did he say?" "He said he'd tell me a lot of funny stories and then you'd stick it in my..." I said, "That is absolutely not true." And Hillary said, "Oh, stop it." She said, "Ann, I know all about you because Barbara Pryor has told me about you. You two are going to be among the first people in the White House." 2 weeks later, there we are. So that was the start I had with Clinton. I worked with him on senior citizens. I'd watch out for the AARP. They'll cremate you. You 38 million Americans bound together by a common love of airline discounts. So anyway, Clinton and I we had a good time. And
but Clinton reached out to you in that, and one of the things that I think that is not done nearly enough. One president we haven't mentioned is Lyndon Johnson, who, despite his unhappy end, had a period when he was a truly great president, and that was when he picked up the mantle of civil rights. And talk about courage and clarity in a president. There was that period early in his presidency when he fought for civil rights and finished the work that President Kennedy had started. And one of the main ways he did this was working with Republicans.
Well, he couldn't work with the Democrats. I mean, they were
Well, he couldn't
filibustering
work with the Southern Democrats. He couldn't work with the Southern Democrats, but there were Republicans of great courage, many of whom were lost to history. Bill McCullough of Ohio, the ranking Republican on the Judiciary Committee, had as much to do with civil rights legislation as anybody in this country. And Lyndon Johnson leaned heavily on people like that and brought them into the coalition. And that was an act of great presidential leadership because he was also willing to share the credit with the Republicans.
Well, actually, you know, now we have the Johnson tapes. Lady Bird Johnson, in a great moment in terms of history, allowed those tapes to be released and having not a clue what was on them. And she still doesn't know. I mean, she doesn't know the ones that haven't been played yet. She's terrified, but she's and she is quite valiant. You know, she's had a terrible stroke and can't speak, but she understands everything and can communicate. And so she let those decided to just let it out there. And he completely forgets that he's got the microphone on, and so you hear, you know, Lyndon Johnson raw, which turns out to be much cleaner than you would expect. But unlike Richard Nixon, but the conversations of the arm twisting on civil rights are quite wonderful. But then in the end, when the bill passed, he was very insistent because it was about to be time for the Republican convention. And it was July 4th weekend. It was all, you know, a lot going on. Bobby Kennedy did not want them to sign the bill. You hear that conversation going before the weekend. And he says, and Johnson says, we have to sign it now because the Republicans are going off to their convention and they need to be here for the signing because they were so instrumental in getting the bill passed. And, you know, that's not him posing for history. That's him having an argument with somebody in his cabinet about how to do this right. So, did you find, Professor Schlesinger, those moments in the White House to be, as Senator Simpson said, though, I mean, those moments of wandering through the White House and saying, here I am?
Yes, as a historian, Steve mentioned whether Alan encountered ghosts. And was invited to the White House shortly after I came down for dinner. And there were Alice Roosevelt Longwood, who was a Republican, and Sam Rayburn. And the amount of accumulated wisdom and experience and wit in Washington. The President-elect Kennedy came to Cambridge in January '61 and set up headquarters in my house on Irving Street. And in the midst of interviews with the recruiting the Harvard faculty, he said to me, "Bobby tells me that you are willing to go down as a special assistant." And I said, yes, historians would relish the experience of presidential decision-making and the process of witnessing the experience of presidents, but I'm not sure what I would be doing, specifically. And he said, Kennedy said, "I'm not sure what I would be doing since you're president, but there will be enough to keep us both busy."
And that was true.
That was true.
You know, during that period in January of 1961, when President Kennedy was shaping his cabinet, one of the things he did, he was still on the Board of Overseers at Harvard. And I was a freshman that year, and your son was not only a classmate of mine, but in Holworthy Hall with me. Steve, Professor Schlesinger's son Steve, I were right in the same dorm.
Yeah.
And President Kennedy walked across Harvard Yard to go to the overseers meeting. And the first time I ever saw a president was sitting in my window at Holworthy Hall, watching elect President Kennedy walk across that lawn to that meeting. But as a member of the Harvard Board of Overseers, President Kennedy, in his first months in Washington, one of his momentous decisions that he had to make had to do with the fact that Harvard was thinking of changing its diplomas from Latin to English. And this was the huge issue on the Harvard campus. And
This is pre-Vietnam.
and I was a freshman on the Crimson, and we're sitting around one night and saying, let's call the White House to find out how the president is going to vote on this issue of overwhelming national importance. And I had met Dean Bundy briefly, and who was, along with Professor Schlesinger, of course, had gone down to become the National Security Advisor. So I'm deputized, the rookie from Bayonne, New Jersey, is deputized to call the White House and try to get through to Dean Bundy, and he took my call. So he said, the Crimson, are you guys still in business? Now, you have to understand that this was right after the Bay of Pigs, and the first stories in the New York Times criticizing the president were just starting. So we wrote a ha-ha-ha, and I talked to him a little bit about this momentous decision about English and Latin. And when we wrote our story that night, in a burst of
Sophomore.
this defined sophomoric, although I was only a freshman, but it was sophomoric. We wrote, in our last paragraph, we wrote, last night when reached in the White House, Dean Bundy asked the Crimson, ha-ha-ha, are you guys still in business? The Crimson, in a fit of self-control, refrained from asking Dean Bundy the same question. The next summer, a bunch of Harvard students who were in Washington organized a lunch group. I'm sure Professor Schlesinger came, because we had all of our professors were in Washington, not Cambridge. So we had a series of these lunches. Dean Bundy was the first guy. And I got there early because I wanted a good seat. And I'm sitting across from him, and he says, Roberts, he says, you're the guy who wrote that story. I said, yes. He said, you'd be interested to know what the president had to say when he read that story. And we knew we sent the Crimson every morning to the White House. We had no idea whether the president ever read it. So Mac says, he's summoned by the president who's sitting there reading our story in the Crimson. And he looks up at me and says, Mac, how could you be so stupid? He said, you knew if you said something like that to those guys, they'd only turn it against you. So I have fond memories of that year as well.
Alan, how important is humor in a presidency?
Oh, I think it's critical. My mother, our mother, my brother and I, taught us that humor was the universal solvent against the abrasive elements of life. And that really is, because I would get hammered. And then you want to remember Danny Kaye, who I knew too. He conducted the symphony one time when I was involved. He said, all humor comes from pain. And that is very real. All humor comes from pain. You use it as a sword and a shield in your life. Bob Reich is a classic example. He and I are doing a national public radio series for 8 months.
Which is a great idea, except that the visual element is missing.
Well, we did a 17-week show on WGBH in Boston called The Long and the Short of It. And this series is on civility in government and how you seriously disagree. And the reason we are very close, they were with us in Cody, Claire and Bob last week, is because of our sense of humor. There is no other binding agent like it. And our first guest was Christy Todd Whitman, then we will do Danforth, and then Bill Bradley and Panetta. So it's going to be a good series, and it's not clawing at each other and bitching back and forth. You can't even hear some of these shows, but what the hell was your question? Yes. Oh, yes, humor. It is, and Reagan was tops, but so was Bush, but he never showed it. I'll never forget. I have to tell you these little tidbits. It was at the Kennedy Center one night, and we're in the president's box. You know, I mean, it's quite classy. You come out, and you hope people will see you coming out of the president's box. And there was this huge vase. You remember, it was there in the lobby for a long while. It was a vase, actually. A difference between a vase and a vase. A vase is over $35, and a vase is under $35. But Bush walked up to this thing and he said, Etruscan, no question about it. I can see by the clay and the glaze that, especially that particular purple glaze, is about 1640. Well, I said, oh, no, I don't think so. That type of clay was unknown except out in the area around Rome, without a question. Well, there were people gathered around. Finally, Barbara and Ann said, knock it off. It was so bad. But he had that, and nobody ever really saw that. But he was fun. He is fun. We go out and kill birds and eat them. I know it's a terrible thing. Yes, we kill quail and eat them. It's a disgusting thing, but we do that every year.
I'm going to try something here, and we'll see if it works, which is we have a few minutes for questions from you. And if you say it loudly enough, I'll repeat it for the camera, and we will see if we can get some questions in from the audience. So does anybody? Yes, go ahead, Ken.
Steve, you left out the two qualities of intelligence and character.
Okay, the point made is the two qualities were left out of Steve's analysis: intelligence and character.
Well, I would certainly agree with you on both of those, Ken, particularly on character. I think sometimes intelligence can be overrated in a curious way, because I think it can be the enemy of clarity sometimes. I think we've had presidents like Carter and even to some extent Clinton who were almost too smart, that they saw so many sides of every question that it led to a certain paralysis of leadership. I think that whatever you think about Ronald Reagan, the direction and clarity and strength of his presidency came, at least in part, from the absence of doubt and the absence of complexity in his thinking. Would like to have smart presidents, but I can see a certain conflict on that. On the issue of character, I agree completely. In fact, academics who've studied the presidency and have looked at great presidents and have tried to, in a systematic way, isolate variables, have often come back to the issue of character, or as some have described it, moral character, as the quality that runs through many, if not all, of the people who are considered greatest presidents by. Now, that's hard to define. And when I talked about honesty, I was getting at some of that. When I talked about courage, I was getting at some of that. But there's no doubt, you know, one of the things as a reporter, and you know this as well as I do because you've covered a lot of campaigns, we often, reporters are often accused of covering the personal lives of candidates and not their positions. But the fact is that often what defines a presidency is not the position they have on trade or the position they have on Medicaid. It's the qualities of character and judgment that they bring to the job that they then bring to issues that were never even discussed during the campaign. Karen Hughes told me that during the campaign of 2000, you know how many times George Bush, the younger, was asked about the Taliban? The answer is once.
That was in Afghanistan.
You know, Howard Feynman of Newsweek, she said, was the only person. And this issue became the major issue of the first 2 years of his campaign. So that reinforces your point. That you, sometimes I think as journalists, we almost get intimidated by critics who say you shouldn't be writing about people's personal lives, and you certainly shouldn't be doing it from a scandalous point of view. But how can voters understand the character of somebody unless we know how they've made judgments and behaved in the past? So I think we owe the democracy and owe voters considerable examination of their personal and private lives in the past, not from a point of view of sensationalism, but from the point of view of understanding the character and judgment.
Right. That gets to Professor Schlesinger, a question. I think one of the most interesting things I've seen in my lifetime is the reevaluation of President Truman. You know, when I was a kid and he was president, he was very controversial, and a lot of people thought he was just a bumbler in the Hawaiian shirts and all of that. And now I think that he is considered one of the great presidents. And is it because of his character?
I think the Korean War destroyed Truman. In 1952, he had 25% roughly of approval rating. And the Vietnam War destroyed Johnson for a while. And then the Great Society has rehabilitated Johnson. And I think the Iraq War will destroy Bush's reputation. And, but Harry Truman never equivocated. And I think this was a quality that was appreciated much more in retrospect than as president.
Well, that is, there's another one. It's called integrity. And if you have integrity, nothing else matters. And if you don't have integrity, nothing else matters. And I watched that in presidents that I knew. But Cokie, I remember when, and this lady is much younger than I am, but she did bring up, they thought Harry Truman was a silly haberdasher from Missouri who was a captive of the Pendergrass gang and an absolute idiot. In fact, there was a joke that went around that he was in a plane and he had $100 bills, and he said, should I throw out $1 and make one person happy, or 100 and make 100 people happy? And this guy said, throw yourself out and make everybody happy. And that was Harry Truman. And
in 1946, the Republicans ran on the basis, to err is Truman.
And then another wonderful.
And they took the House with a veto-proof majority.
But Clinton had a tremendous intelligence. It was something to see, and Carter. But it was Truman, you remember, who said the country is run by C students. And so Gergen and I did a shtick at Harvard, and they were talking about academics and intelligence. There was a lot of that at Harvard, really. And I couldn't have got into Harvard if I'd picked the lock. So Gergen said the best presidents were the guys who weren't the intellectuals. But Clinton called us into altogether the leadership on Somalia. He gave a position on where we should go, and he went around the room, and it took about an hour. And it was awesome. He knew every nuance of Somalia and what was going on and the emotion of it. And then he went around the room, he said, "How about you, Al?" I said, "Well, that was great, but I'll tell you, if the guy on the bar stool in Buffalo can't understand that in 10 minutes, it's hopeless if that's what you're going to go out and say." "Oh," I said, "thanks a million. I'm glad I came to you." And so he then came out about 3 days later and gave a speech to the nation, which was pure power. It was 7 to 10 minutes. And I saw him a week later, and he jabbed me and said, "Do you think the guy on the bar stool of Buffalo picked that up?" I said, "You got it. That's exactly what it was." But he.
In an earlier session here on traits of great leadership, one of the early traits given was the ability to change one's mind and move and grow. In my memory, Bush 41 was hurt terribly by his courageous change on taxes. Can one of you remember a change by a president that is commendable? Is the ability to change something that presidents are forbidden to do?
The question is, in an earlier session here on traits of leadership, the ability to say, "I was wrong," change your mind, change position is one that was cited as a good trait of leadership. And can presidents do that, or are presidents forbidden from doing that for political reasons?
I can think of two that Clinton did that looking back, turned out to be very important elements on the plus side of his presidency, but were widely criticized, particularly by liberals in his own party. One was balancing the budget, and the other was welfare reform. And these were two issues where he defied the conventional wisdom of his party and learned. I mean, his learning curve from Bob Rubin in particular about managing the economy went against a lot of what he believed when he became president, went against a lot of some of the precepts of liberal democratic economics before that, and he railed against it. You look at Elizabeth Drew's book about the first year of the Clinton presidency, it's fascinating where he's screaming, you know, the bond traders are dictating my presidency. But he learned from Rubin that if you satisfied the bond markets, a lot of other good things happened, and so I think that's a very good example.
But the example you
of
used was George Bush the first and taxes, and you remember that was the same problem in the Republican Party. The House members started running against the president.
That was the most outrageous Republican activity I have ever seen. They met out there at the air base. You remember, it was called the air base,
It was at
Andrews Air Base, and they had to meet there so that there was no media and no interruption. Dole would come back.
We were all outside the gate.
I know, but Dole would come back and report to us, and Gingrich would go back and report to the House. And finally, and here's what was in the package: complete budget reform, annual budgeting, a cutting of the entitlements programs, catastrophic health care, which would have been cheap at that time compared to what we're headed for. And so they came to the White House and they said, "Mr. President, George Bush, this will only work if you will say that you will have to repudiate." And he said, "God," I got up at the convention and said, "Read my lips." And they said, "Yeah, but this is bigger than read my lips." Dole said, "We'll pass it for you in the Senate. It'll be bipartisan." And Gingrich kind of went like that. But I'll tell you, it passed the Senate by a vote of about 67 to 30 or something, went to the House, and all you need to know as a historian, Arthur, you'd be fascinated, go look at the roll call vote of how they clobbered it. Newt Gingrich and Howard Berman and Henry Waxman and every conservative, they went at him from both sides, cut it to bits, made another deal, and lost all the advantages of what would have been the most sweeping, important thing that I would have seen in my 18 years. And when I say that, well, I tell you, some of these Republicans come off the wall, but go look at the vote. It just makes you sad. It was stupefying, and of course, it ended Bush's any chance for re-election, but if they'd done it and seen the result, and he had time to see that in the next 2 years, it would have been a different presidency. Very sad, very real, very
One more
tough.
over here.
Looking back on the 43 presidents, who was the greatest and why?
And looking back, I would give you this one, Professor Schlesinger. On all of our presidents, who would you name as the greatest?
Lincoln.
Because he held
Lincoln
the
and the three great presidents, by a consensus of scholars, historians, and political scientists, are Washington, Lincoln, and FDR.
And you give it to Lincoln because he held the country together?
I think Lincoln was the best writer among presidents. He had the best sense of humor. He was a quasi-religious man, but he understood that the unfathomable distance between erring mortals and the Almighty. And he said the Almighty has his own purposes in the second inaugural. And the self-pride, which would, the most dangerous people in the world are the people who think they're executing the will of the Almighty. The Almighty has his own purposes. Mr. Dooley's definition of the fanatic. The fanatic is a person who does what the Lord would do if he only knew the facts in the case.
Well, that is a perfect place to end this session.
Let me just, I would like to ask Arthur, how come with your position in America then and now that you never met FDR?
Because I worked for FDR in the OWI and the OSS during the war, but I never met him. I was in a lowly position, and I was a corporal in the United States Army. I never met my commander-in-chief. I knew Mrs. Roosevelt.
Did you?
And well, and the children well, but I never met FDR.
Can I ask you one other quick question, because I'm very interested in this. Can you be a great president if you're not faced with a great crisis? You mentioned three people who had enormous problems. And one of the, the Clintons to this day will say, we never had a 9/11. We never had a great crisis. Can you be a great president without a great crisis?
Well, a near great president. Jefferson, Jackson, Theodore Roosevelt had no crises. Reagan had no crises. But he imposed without a crisis, the president who can impose their own sense of national priorities on the country. And Jefferson, Jackson, Polk, Cleveland, Theodore Roosevelt, Reagan did impose their own sense of priorities on the public.
And I just say one thing to hearten your
We're
day.
getting there, we're getting
Just,
there.
I know, just is very quick, but it's topical because the Supreme Court nomination. Pat Leahy called me yesterday. I've known him a long time. He's going to visit with the president this week a couple times. he told me, he said, Al, Arlen Specter and I have a good relationship. Arlen's chairman, Leahy's the ranking member, and we're going to do this in an appropriate way. And now, that's an interesting thing coming. And he asked me, which we used to do, if I had any thoughts for him, and I said, just one. Don't talk to either Phyllis Schlafly or Ralph Nays. So I wanted to bring you up to date on that.
Thank you all very, very